The HOA president smiled sweetly as she pulled over beside my daughter. "Come with me, sweetie." My nonverbal girl, who trusted everyone, climbed in. 300 miles later, they left her on a highway with a note pinned to her shirt, "Problem solved." They had no idea whose child they just destroyed. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. The courtroom was silent as I delivered my verdict. 23 years on the bench had taught me to separate emotion from justice, but nothing could have prepared me for the phone call that would shatter my world that evening. "Judge Morrison. This is Officer Chen from the California Highway Patrol. We found your daughter wandering along Interstate 5, approximately 300 miles north of San Diego." My blood turned to ice. "Emma? My Emma?" "Yes, ma'am. She's safe now, but she's extremely distressed. She was found near Bakersfield, dehydrated and sunburned." "Ma'am, how did a nonverbal 17-year-old girl end up alone on a highway 300 miles from home?" My hands trembled as I gripped the phone. "Emma. My beautiful, innocent Emma, who couldn't speak, who trusted everyone, who smiled at strangers and believed the world was good. Emma, who needed constant supervision, who couldn't tell anyone if she was scared or hurt or lost." "I don't understand," I whispered. "She was supposed to be walking home from the community center. It's only 6 blocks from our house." "Ma'am, I think you need to come up here. There's more to this story." I was already grabbing my car keys, my judge's robe still hanging from my shoulders. "I'm coming. Tell her Mama's coming. Don't leave her alone." The 3-hour drive to Bakersfield was the longest of my life. My mind raced with terrible possibilities. Emma had been walking home from her daily art therapy session at the community center, the same walk she'd made 100 times before. Our neighborhood was safe, quiet, filled with families who knew Emma, who waved at her, who looked out for her. What had happened? When I finally reached the highway patrol station, I ran inside, my heels clicking frantically against the linoleum floor. A young officer led me to a small room where Emma sat wrapped in a blanket, rocking back and forth, her face streaked with tears and dirt. "Baby." I fell to my knees in front of her, pulling her into my arms. "Emma, sweetheart, Mama's here." She buried her face in my shoulder, her whole body shaking with silent sobs. Emma couldn't speak, but she communicated in 1,000 other ways. Right now, every tremor told me she had been terrified beyond measure. Officer Chen approached carefully. "Judge Morrison, your daughter was found by a trucker around 4 p.m. She'd been walking along the shoulder of the highway. She's dehydrated, has minor heat exhaustion, and some cuts on her feet from walking in sandals. The hospital checked her over. Physically, she'll be fine." "Physically," I repeated, hearing the word he left unspoken. The psychological trauma would be another matter entirely. "Judge, there's something else." He handed me a small card. This was pinned to her shirt. My vision blurred as I read the printed words, "Problem solved. No special needs in our community. Pacific Heights HOA Board." The air left my lungs. The Homeowners Association, our HOA, the board that had been complaining about Emma for months. They did this? My voice was barely a whisper, but underneath it was a rage so profound I could taste it. They took my daughter and dumped her on a highway 300 miles away. Officer Chen's jaw was tight. "We're investigating. The trucker who found her said she was disoriented and scared. She'd been walking for hours, Judge. In 90-degree heat. If he hadn't stopped. He didn't need to finish. I knew. My Emma, my precious girl who couldn't ask for help, who couldn't tell anyone she was lost or thirsty or afraid, could have died on that highway." I held her tighter, and she made a small sound, the wordless whimper that meant she was overwhelmed. I rocked her gently, the way I had when she was small, and began to hum her favorite lullaby. Over the next few days, as Emma slowly recovered in the safety of our home, the investigation revealed a conspiracy so cruel, so calculated, that even my years of seeing humanity's worst couldn't prepare me for it. It started 6 months earlier when Karen Whitmore became president of our HOA board. Karen, with her perfectly highlighted hair and her pressed tennis outfits, who smiled with too many teeth and spoke in a voice dripping with false sweetness. Karen had moved into the neighborhood with her husband and 2 perfect children. Within weeks, she'd positioned herself to take over the HOA, promising to restore property values and maintain community standards. What she really meant was, make Pacific Heights less welcoming to anyone who didn't fit her narrow definition of normal. The first complaint came after Emma had a meltdown at the community pool. She'd been overwhelmed by the noise and the crowds, and she'd screamed, flapping her hands, tears streaming down her face. I'd calmed her within minutes, but Karen had watched with disgust. "That girl is disturbing the peace," she'd said loudly. "This is a family community. We can't have that kind of behavior here." I tried to explain. "My daughter is autistic and nonverbal. She has every right to use community facilities." "Perhaps," Karen had replied with that false smile, "but does she have the right to ruin everyone else's enjoyment?" The complaints multiplied. Emma walked too slowly on the sidewalk. Emma made sounds that disturbed neighbors. Emma's presence in the community park made other children uncomfortable. Each complaint was filed officially with the HOA, each one signed by Karen and her board members, Richard Chen, a banker who nodded at everything Karen said, Susan Miller, who feared Karen's social power, and David Torres, who seemed perpetually confused but went along with the majority. I'd fought back. I'd cited the Fair Housing Act, the Americans with Disabilities Act, every legal protection that guaranteed Emma's right to exist in her own neighborhood. I'd spoken at HOA meetings, I'd filed complaints, I'd made it clear that any attempt to force Emma out would result in a lawsuit. Karen had smiled through it all. "Of course, Judge Morrison. We would never discriminate. We simply want what's best for the community." But behind the scenes, she was planning something far worse than discrimination. Through the investigation, Officer Chen and the San Diego Police Department uncovered the plot. It had been carefully orchestrated, timed for a day when I was in court, unable to be reached. Karen had approached Emma as she walked home from the community center. Emma knew Karen from the neighborhood, and despite my warnings, Emma trusted people. Karen had smiled and told Emma something, we'd never know exactly what, and Emma had gotten into Karen's van. The security footage from a gas station in Bakersfield showed Karen purchasing a bottle of water and a granola bar. She'd led Emma to a rest stop, given her the food and drink, and then driven away, leaving my nonverbal daughter alone in a strange place, 300 miles from home, with no way to communicate her identity or address. The note pinned to Emma's shirt was the final cruelty. A message to me, to everyone, this is what happens when you don't conform. When the police arrested Karen Whitmore, she showed no remorse. "I did what needed to be done," she said calmly. "That girl was destroying property values. She was a nuisance. I gave her food and water. I didn't hurt her. I just removed the problem. She could have died," the detective had said. Karen had shrugged. "Well, she didn't." Emma didn't speak, but in the weeks following her abandonment, she said everything through her silence. She stopped sleeping. I'd find her in the middle of the night, sitting in her closet, rocking back and forth, her eyes wide and terrified. She wouldn't let me leave her sight. If I went to another room, she'd follow, her hand clutching my sleeve, panic in her eyes. She stopped eating. The girl who loved strawberries and peanut butter sandwiches now pushed food away, her face turning pale at the sight of it. I had to coax every bite into her mouth, had to promise I wouldn't leave, had to hold her while she forced down nutrition she desperately needed. She stopped going outside. The daughter who had loved walking, who had found peace in the rhythm of her steps, now screamed silently when I tried to open the front door. Her whole body would go rigid, and she'd shake her head violently, tears streaming down her face. The therapist explained it gently. Emma's been traumatized. She trusted someone from her community, and that person betrayed her in the most fundamental way. She was taken from everything familiar and abandoned. For someone who can't verbally communicate, who relies on routines and familiar places to feel safe, this was psychological torture. I watched my daughter disappear into herself, and the rage inside me grew into something cold and precise. Karen Whitmore had tried to destroy Emma's life. Now, I would make sure justice destroyed hers. But justice moved slowly, and every day, I watched Emma suffer. One afternoon, 3 weeks after the incident, I found Emma in her room, holding a photograph. It was a picture from her 10th birthday, both of us smiling at the camera, her face covered in chocolate cake. She touched the image gently, then looked at me with eyes so full of sadness that my heart shattered. She pointed at the girl in the photo, then at herself, then shook her head slowly. "You feel like that happy girl is gone?" I asked softly. She nodded, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. I pulled her close. "Baby, she's still there. Karen tried to break you, but you're stronger than she knows. We're going to get through this. I promise." But even as I said it, I wondered if we would. If my daughter would ever feel safe again. If she'd ever walk freely in her own neighborhood, ever trust a stranger's smile, ever be the joyful girl who saw beauty in everything. Karen Whitmore hadn't just abandoned Emma on a highway. She'd tried to abandon Emma's spirit, her trust, her joy. And for that, there could be no mercy. The preliminary hearing was set for 6 weeks after Emma's abandonment. Karen Whitmore was charged with kidnapping, child endangerment, child abuse, and a hate crime enhancement due to disability discrimination. I'd recused myself from the case, of course. I couldn't be the judge. But I could be there as Emma's mother, as her advocate, as the voice she'd never have. Karen entered the courtroom in a designer suit, her lawyer by her side. She looked confident, composed, as if this were a minor inconvenience. She glanced at me once, and I saw something like pity in her eyes, as if she thought I was overreacting. The prosecution was led by District Attorney James Rodriguez, a man I'd worked with for years. He was thorough, passionate, and he'd seen the photos of Emma, dehydrated and terrified, on that highway. "Your Honor," he began, addressing Judge Patricia Freeman, who was handling the case, "this is not a simple case of poor judgment. This was a calculated, premeditated act designed to remove a disabled child from her community through the most cruel means possible." Karen's lawyer, a slick man named Gregory March, stood smoothly. "Your Honor, my client made a mistake, yes, but her intentions were never to harm the child. She provided food and water. She left her in a populated area where she'd be found. This is being blown out of proportion by a mother who, understandably, is emotional about her special needs daughter." Special needs daughter. The way he said it, like Emma was a problem to be managed, not a person to be valued. James didn't miss a beat. The defendant abandoned a nonverbal 17-year-old girl 300 miles from her home, in a strange place, unable to communicate her identity or ask for help. Emma Morrison walked along a highway in 90-degree heat for hours. She was found with severe dehydration, heat exhaustion, and psychological trauma that continues to this day. If a trucker hadn't happened to see her, if he hadn't stopped, Emma Morrison would likely be dead. He pulled up photos on the screen. Emma, wrapped in that blanket, her face dirty and tear-stained. Emma's feet, cut and blistered from walking in sandals. Emma in the hospital, small and broken. I heard someone in the gallery gasp. Several people were crying. James continued, his voice hard. The defendant left a note pinned to Emma's shirt. "Problem solved. No special needs in our community. This wasn't a mistake, Your Honor. This was a hate crime. This was an attempt to erase a disabled child because she didn't meet the defendant's standards of normalcy." Judge Freeman's face was stone. "Mr. March, how do you respond?" March cleared his throat. "Your Honor, The HOA had received numerous complaints about Emma Morrison's behavior. My client was trying to address a community concern. She used poor judgment, yes, but there was no intent to cause serious harm. No intent? James's voice rose. She drove a vulnerable, nonverbal teenager 300 miles away and left her alone. What did she think would happen? March spread his hands. My client believed someone would find Emma quickly and contact authorities. She didn't realize. Didn't realize what? James interrupted. That a nonverbal girl couldn't tell people who she was or where she lived. That's the entire point, Your Honor. The defendant knew exactly how vulnerable Emma was. She exploited that vulnerability. The hearing continued for hours. Witnesses testified. The trucker who found Emma, his voice breaking as he described her terrified eyes, the officer who first responded, explaining Emma's condition. Emma's therapist, detailing the severe psychological trauma. And then, they called me. I walked to the stand with my head high, but inside, I was trembling. I placed my hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth, though truth seemed inadequate for what I needed to convey. James approached gently. Judge Morrison, can you describe Emma for us? Who is your daughter? I took a breath. Emma is 17 years old. She was born with a rare chromosomal disorder that left her nonverbal. She can't speak, but she communicates through gestures, through expressions, through the art she creates. She's brilliant, actually. Her drawings are extraordinary. She sees the world in colors and shapes the rest of us miss. What was Emma like before this incident? Happy, I said simply. She was so happy. She loved walking. She'd walk around the neighborhood every day, waving at neighbors, stopping to watch birds or admire flowers. She loved the community center, where she took art classes. She loved her routine, her life. She felt safe. And after? My voice cracked. After, she won't leave the house. She won't eat without me present. She has nightmares every night. She flinches when she sees cars that look like Karen's van. The therapist says she has PTSD. My daughter, who once trusted the world, now lives in constant fear. Why did Karen Whitmore target your daughter? Because Emma is different. Because she doesn't fit Karen's perfect picture of what a community should look like. Because Karen sees people like Emma as problems to be eliminated, not human beings to be valued. March stood for cross-examination. Judge Morrison, isn't it true that there were numerous complaints about Emma's behavior? There were complaints filed by Karen Whitmore and her board members, I corrected. Complaints designed to justify discrimination. But Emma did have public outbursts, didn't she? She screamed in the pool area. My daughter had a sensory overload in a crowded space. I calmed her within minutes. She has every legal right to use community facilities. Some might argue that a person who can't control their behavior is disruptive too. My daughter can control her behavior, I interrupted, my voice sharp. What she can't control is her disability. And what people like you and your client can't seem to understand is that disability doesn't make someone less human, less worthy of respect, less deserving of safety. March backed off, but the damage was done. He'd said what Karen's whole defense rested on, that Emma's disability somehow justified what had been done to her. Judge Freeman called a recess, and I sat in the hallway, shaking. James sat beside me. You did well, he said. It's not enough. March is going to argue that Karen was just removing a nuisance. He's going to make Emma sound like a problem. Then we'll make sure the jury sees Emma as a person. As a daughter. As a victim. But I wasn't sure it would be enough. I'd seen too many cases where disabilities were treated as inconveniences, where discrimination was disguised as community standards, where cruelty was excused as not understanding. I'd fought my whole career for justice, but now, watching my daughter's abuser walk free on bail, smiling confidently, I wondered if justice would ever be enough. The trial began 3 months later. In that time, Emma had made slow progress. She was eating again, sleeping in her own bed, though she still wouldn't go outside alone. The prosecution wanted Emma to testify. James approached me carefully. "I know it's asking a lot," he said. "But if the jury could see Emma, hear from her in whatever way she can communicate, it would be powerful." I was torn. She can't speak. How can she testify? She can be present. She can show the jury who she is. We can have her art therapist there, someone she trusts. She can draw, she can gesture. The jury needs to see her as a real person, not just the special needs daughter March keeps calling her. I asked Emma. I showed her pictures of the courtroom, explained what would happen, asked if she wanted to try. She looked at me for a long time, then picked up her sketch pad. She drew quickly, intently, and when she was done, she showed me the image. It was a picture of her and me, holding hands, standing in front of a judge's bench. Above us, she'd drawn a bright sun. At the bottom, in her careful, practiced handwriting, she'd written one word, justice. "You want to do this?" I asked, my voice thick with emotion. She nodded firmly. On the day of her testimony, I walked with Emma into the courtroom. She wore her favorite purple dress, and she held my hand tightly. When she saw Karen Whitmore at the defense table, she went rigid, her breathing shallow. Karen stared at her with cold eyes. Judge Freeman spoke gently. "Emma, you don't have to be afraid. You're safe here." Emma's art therapist, Mrs. Chen, sat beside her with a sketch pad and colored pencils. James approached slowly. "Emma, can you show the jury what you felt when you were left in Bakersfield?" Emma's hand shook as she picked up a black pencil. She drew quickly, and the courtroom watched in silence as the image emerged. It was a small figure, alone in darkness, surrounded by massive shapes that loomed over her. The figure had no face, no features, just emptiness. Above it, scribbled in harsh black lines, were words, "Alone. Scared. Lost." Several jurors were crying. James spoke softly. "Emma, before this happened, were you happy?" Emma nodded vigorously. She flipped to a new page and drew again. This time, the image was full of color, bright houses, smiling stick figures, flowers and trees. In the center, a girl with arms spread wide, a huge smile on her face. "And now?" Emma's face crumpled. She drew a third image, the same girl, but curled into a ball, gray rain falling around her, the houses in the background dark and menacing. "Emma," James said, his voice breaking slightly, "do you want to tell the jury anything else?" Emma looked directly at the jury. Tears streamed down her face. She picked up her pencil one more time and wrote in large, careful letters, "I am a person. I matter." The courtroom was silent except for the sound of people crying. I was crying too, holding Emma's shoulder, so proud of her courage I thought my heart would burst. March stood for cross-examination, but Judge Freeman held up a hand. "Mr. March, this witness is nonverbal and has suffered significant trauma. Do you have questions that can be answered through drawing or gesture?" March looked at Emma, at the jury's faces, at the drawings in front of them. "No, Your Honor. No questions." He sat down, and I knew we'd won something important. Not the case, not yet, but something deeper. Emma had made herself seen, heard in the only way she could. She was no longer just the special needs daughter. She was Emma, a person with feelings and worth and dignity. As we left the courtroom that day, Emma squeezed my hand 3 times. "Our code. I love you." I squeezed back 4 times. "I love you too." The trial lasted 2 weeks. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence, the security footage, the note, testimony from neighbors about Karen's campaign against Emma, expert testimony about the psychological harm caused by the abandonment. The defense tried to paint Karen as a community leader who made a mistake, who never intended Raoul harm. March brought in character witnesses who spoke of Karen's charity work, her involvement in the PDA, her dedication to the neighborhood. But nothing could erase that image of Emma alone on the highway. Nothing could justify the note pinned to her shirt. In his closing argument, James stood before the jury with quiet intensity. Emma Morrison trusted her community. She trusted the adults in her neighborhood to keep her safe. Karen Whitmore betrayed that trust in the most profound way possible. She didn't just abandon Emma physically. She tried to abandon her humanity, to erase her existence because Emma didn't fit her narrow view of normalcy. The defense wants you to believe this was a mistake, poor judgment. But the evidence shows premeditation. Karen planned this. She waited for a day when Emma's mother would be unreachable. She lured Emma into her vehicle. She drove 300 miles. She abandoned a vulnerable, nonverbal teenager in a strange place and drove away. She pinned a note to Emma's shirt. Problem solved. Those words tell you everything you need to know about Karen Whitmore's intentions. She saw a disabled child as a problem to be solved, not a human being to be protected. Emma survived. But she survived through luck, through the kindness of a stranger, through sheer chance. If that trucker hadn't stopped, if Emma had wandered onto the highway, if she'd collapsed from dehydration before someone found her, we'd be here for a very different trial. You've seen Emma. You've seen her drawings, her pain, her courage. You've heard testimony about the nightmares, the fear, the trauma that continues to this day. Karen Whitmore tried to erase Emma from her community, from her life. Don't let her erase Emma from justice. Hold her accountable. Find her guilty. March's closing argument tried to appeal to sympathy for Karen, to suggest that she'd acted out of misguided concern for the community. But his words rang hollow against the weight of evidence. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned, the forewoman stood. On the count of kidnapping, we find the defendant guilty. On the count of child endangerment, we find the defendant guilty. On the count of child abuse, we find the defendant guilty. On the hate crime enhancement, we find the defendant guilty. Karen's face went white. She turned to her lawyer, mouthing protests, but the verdict had been delivered. I felt Emma's hand slip into mine. She was crying, but this time, they were different tears. Relief, validation, justice. Judge Freeman set sentencing for 3 weeks later. As the bailiffs led Karen away, she turned and looked at me one final time. There was hatred in her eyes, and disbelief. She'd thought she'd get away with it. She'd thought her privilege, her position, her perfect image would protect her. She'd been wrong. The courtroom was packed for sentencing. Neighbors from our community filled the gallery, some supporting us, others looking uncomfortable, perhaps realizing their own complicity in Karen's campaign of discrimination. Judge Freeman called the court to order. Ms. Whitmore, you've been found guilty on all counts. Before I impose sentence, does the victim wish to make a statement? I stood, my victim impact statement prepared. But as I looked down at Emma beside me, I realized she had something to say too. Your Honor, my daughter would like to present something to the court. Judge Freeman nodded kindly. Of course. Emma stood on shaking legs. Mrs. Chen was beside her with a large poster board. Emma had worked on it for days, and now she held it up for the court to see. It was a painting, beautiful and heartbreaking. On the left side, a dark highway stretched into the distance, a small figure walking alone under a burning sun. On the right side, the same figure stood in front of a house, surrounded by colors and light, holding hands with a woman who was clearly me. Between the two images, Emma had painted bars, like a prison cell. Behind the bars was a face twisted with anger and cruelty, clearly meant to be Karen. At the bottom, Emma had written, "She tried to take my home. She tried to take my safety. She tried to take my life. But I'm still here. I survived. And I want her to know that people like me matter. We belong." We won't be erased. The courtroom was silent. Several people were openly sobbing. Karen stared at the painting, her face pale, but she showed no remorse. I took the microphone next. Your Honor, members of the court, Karen Whitmore didn't just commit a crime against my daughter. She committed a crime against every person with a disability who dares to exist in public spaces. Emma's only offense was being different. She couldn't speak, so she couldn't defend herself. She trusted her community, so she was easy to manipulate. She loved her neighborhood, so being torn from it was especially traumatic. Karen saw all of Emma's vulnerabilities and exploited them. She planned Emma's removal like someone planning a vacation. She executed it without mercy. And even now, after being found guilty, she shows no remorse. I've served as a judge for over 2 decades. I've seen terrible crimes, committed by people driven by desperation, addiction, mental illness. I've learned to see the humanity even in those who commit terrible acts. But I see no humanity in what Karen Whitmore did. I see only cruelty, only hatred, only a complete disregard for a child's life and dignity. Emma will carry the scars of this for the rest of her life. She may never fully trust again. She may never feel truly safe. And for what? Because Karen Whitmore decided my daughter wasn't worthy of existing in her community. Your Honor, I ask that you impose the maximum sentence. Not for revenge, but to send a message that we will not tolerate this kind of hatred. That people with disabilities are protected under law. That their lives matter. That they cannot be disposed of like trash when someone finds them inconvenient. Judge Freeman turned to Karen. Ms. Whitmore, do you wish to address the court? Karen stood, her lawyer's hand on her arm, warning her. But she shook him off. I don't understand, she said, her voice sharp. I didn't hurt her. I gave her food and water. I left her where people would find her. I was trying to help my community, to protect property values, to maintain standards. That girl was a disruption. Everyone was complaining. I was just doing what needed to be done. The courtroom erupted. Judge Freeman banged her gavel. Order. But Karen continued, her voice rising. You're all acting like I committed murder. She's fine. She's sitting right there. So I moved her somewhere else. So what? Maybe now her mother will understand that some people don't belong in certain communities. The room went absolutely silent. Judge Freeman's face was like stone. Ms. Whitmore, you just demonstrated exactly why this court must impose the harshest possible sentence. You show no understanding of the severity of your actions. No remorse. No empathy. You kidnapped a vulnerable, disabled child and abandoned her 300 miles from her home. You left her alone, unable to communicate, in life-threatening conditions. The only reason Emma Morrison is alive is through chance and the kindness of a stranger. But beyond the physical crime, you committed a crime against human dignity. You decided that a person with disabilities had no right to exist in your community. You took it upon yourself to erase her, as if she were a problem to be solved rather than a person to be valued. Your words today have removed any doubt I had about your character and your intentions. You are a danger to every vulnerable person who might have the misfortune of encountering you. On the charge of kidnapping, I sentence you to 15 years in state prison. On the charge of child endangerment, 10 years consecutive. On the charge of child abuse, 5 years consecutive. The hate crime enhancement adds an additional 5 years. You will serve 35 years in state prison. You will be required to register as a child offender. You will be prohibited from serving in any HOA or community organization upon your release. Additionally, I'm recommending that the state pursue civil rights violations. Your HOA board members who enabled this discrimination will face their own consequences. Court is adjourned. The gavel fell. Karen screamed. 35 years. For moving a girl. This is insane. She's fine. She's right there. This is a miscarriage of justice. The bailiffs moved forward, but Karen lunged toward us, her face twisted with rage. You've ruined my life. All because of your freak daughter. She's the problem, not me. She doesn't belong. The bailiffs grabbed her, pulling her away as she continued to scream. The courtroom watched in shocked silence as Karen Whitmore, who had tried so hard to project an image of perfection and control, fell apart completely. As they dragged her through the doors, her last words echoed through the room, "She doesn't belong. People like her don't belong." Judge Freeman spoke quietly. "But people like her do belong, Ms. Whitmore. Emma Morrison belongs in her community, in her home, in this world, just as much as anyone else. More, perhaps, because she had the courage to survive what you tried to do to her. Take her away." The months after sentencing were difficult but healing. Emma still had nightmares, still had moments of fear, but slowly, she began to reclaim her life. The community rallied around us in ways I hadn't expected. Neighbors who had been silent during Karen's campaign spoke up, apologized, asked what they could do. The community center named their art room after Emma. Someone started a petition to make the neighborhood more accessible and welcoming for people with disabilities. The 3 HOA board members who had enabled Karen faced their own consequences. Richard Chen resigned in disgrace, his banking career ruined when his employer learned of his role. Susan Miller issued a tearful public apology and devoted herself to disability advocacy, trying to make amends. David Torres faced civil rights violations and was banned from serving on any HOA board. The HOA itself was dissolved and reformed with new bylaws that explicitly protected disabled residents and prohibited discrimination of any kind. I was asked to serve on the new board to ensure those protections were enforced. But the most important healing happened at home. One morning, 6 months after the trial, I found Emma standing at the front door, her hand on the handle. "Do you want to go outside?" I asked gently. She looked at me, fear in her eyes, but also determination. She nodded slowly. We walked together down the front steps, into the yard, to the sidewalk. Emma's hand gripped mine tightly. Her breathing was fast. But she kept walking. We made it to the end of the block before she had to stop, overwhelmed. But the next day, we went a little farther. And the day after that, farther still. 3 months later, Emma walked to the community center alone for the first time since the abduction. I watched from the window, my heart in my throat, as she made her way down the familiar path. When she came home, she was smiling. She showed me a drawing she'd made in her art class, a girl standing on a hill, arms spread wide, the sun bright above her. At the bottom, she'd written, "I'm still here." She was. She'd survived attempted erasure, survived trauma, survived the cruelty of someone who'd seen her as less than human. And she'd come through it not just alive, but strong. That evening, I found Emma sitting in her room, looking at her paintings. She gestured for me to sit beside her, and she showed me her portfolio, piece by piece. The dark highway, the lonely figure, the gray rain. But then, new paintings, bright colors. Smiling faces. A community coming together. A girl walking proudly down a sidewalk. And the newest one, still wet, a courtroom scene with a judge's gavel, and underneath, the words, "Justice for all." She looked at me, and in her eyes, I saw something I'd been afraid I'd never see again, hope. "You're going to be okay," I said softly. "Better than okay. You're going to be extraordinary." She smiled, that beautiful Emma smile that lit up her whole face. Then she picked up her pencil and wrote something new, "I already am." Emma turned 21 on a beautiful spring day. Our backyard was filled with friends, neighbors, and the community that had come to love and protect her. She'd graduated from high school, completed a specialized art program, and had just been accepted to a supported college program where she'd continue developing her skills. Her paintings hung in a local gallery, selling for hundreds of dollars, with all proceeds going to disability advocacy organizations. More importantly, Emma had found her voice. Not in words, but in art, in gesture, in the way she moved through the world with increasing confidence. She'd become an advocate herself, speaking, through her art and through interpreters, at schools and community centers about disability rights, about inclusion, about the harm of discrimination. She'd turned her trauma into purpose. As for Karen Whitmore, she remained in prison, denied parole at her first hearing when she continued to insist she'd done nothing wrong. The other inmates, I heard, had not treated her kindly when they learned what she'd done to a disabled child. I no longer felt rage when I thought of her. I felt pity. Karen had destroyed her own life through hatred, through her inability to see the humanity in people different from herself. She'd given up everything, her freedom, her family, her future, because she couldn't accept that Emma had a right to exist. That evening, as the party wound down, Emma brought me a wrapped package. Inside was a painting she'd been working on in secret. It showed two figures, a mother and daughter, holding hands. They stood on a path that stretched into the distance, the horizon bright with possibility. Above them, written in Emma's careful hand, were the words, "Thank you for never giving up on me. Thank you for teaching me I matter. Thank you for being my voice until I found my own. I love you, Mama." I pulled her into my arms, both of us crying happy tears. Emma had not just survived. She had triumphed. Karen Whitmore had tried to erase my daughter, to remove her from the world because she didn't fit a narrow definition of normal. But Emma had proven something far more important, that different doesn't mean less, that disability doesn't diminish worth, that every person, regardless of ability, has inherent dignity and value. Emma belonged. She always had. And now, finally, she believed it too. As the sun set over our neighborhood, Emma took my hand and squeezed it 3 times. I squeezed back 4 times. Some conversations don't need words. Some truths are deeper than language. My daughter mattered. She belonged. And nothing, and no one, would ever take that away from her again. Sometimes justice comes from a courtroom verdict. Sometimes it comes from a community learning to embrace difference. And sometimes it comes from a girl who refused to be erased, who stood up and said, in every way she could, I am a person. I matter. I belong. Emma's story is a reminder that the most vulnerable among us deserve the strongest protection, that disability is not a problem to be solved but a natural part of human diversity, and that true justice means making space for every person, regardless of ability, to live, thrive, and belong.